Welcome to Hide and Create, your online writing workshop.
I should have started drinking before I logged on.
Danger, Will Robinson, danger.
You know what? I'm already lost.
That's your thing, Jordan.
Wow.
You say something and you go, right?
Is this being recorded?
Magic mice creatures.
I should have thought of that.
See, I knew I set myself up.
You guys have been passing the joint around while I was going at it.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for being ridiculous there. I could put that in the intro.
Welcome back to Hide and Create. We're going to talk with Jay Wells, in particular about urban fantasy today. I'm also joined by Joshua Essoe and Jordan Ellinger. Real quick, we have a new YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/writingpodcast. You can also just Google probably Hide and Create YouTube. And we'd love it if you'd subscribe to it because we are putting our episodes there and you can look at pretty things while we talk and do our show.
Because you're all very pretty.
Yeah, we definitely believe that. So Jay has been with us for a few shows now, suffering, and she's still hanging in there. We would love to have had Diana on this show as well to talk about urban fantasy because, of course, that's her gig as well. But she is still away for the time being, dealing with some family business. But Jay, we are definitely looking forward to talking about urban fantasy with you today. And, you know, let's toss out the first question any panel at any con has got to ask for urban fantasy, which is how do you define urban fantasy?
Well, I think it depends on who you ask, but to me, it's in some ways kind of become this catch-all for stories that kind of don't fall neatly into like what I would consider like the big genres of fantasy, mystery, romance, you know, the kind of established ones. But typically it's a story that takes elements of magic, of supernatural magic, myth, and set it into like a recognizable human world. Typically it's a city, but it doesn't have to be. And then it blends plot elements and conventions from other genres like mystery, romance, adventure, horror. And I think that urban fantasy, the popular urban fantasy that, you know, I guess it's what people consider urban fantasy, are these books that they're typically series, long-running series. They are often told in a first-person point of view. A lot of urban fantasy right now, the popular version, I guess is what I call it, is dominated by female writers writing female protagonists, although there are some really fabulous male writers writing dudes too. And it's kind of just this like melting pot genre. I mean, it really depends on the writer, as far as how much of each genre shows up in the book. Some of them will have more romance in them. Some of them will have more kind of a typical hero's journey. Some of them will be more of a mystery plot. And so there's just a whole long range of types of stories that fall in the pot of urban fantasy.
And is there a difference between contemporary fantasy versus urban fantasy, or is it just marketing?
I think a lot of it's marketing, and I think that nobody has ever really found like the perfect term for it because, you know, it's really created. I mean, one of my friends, Jean Stein, who writes the Anna Strong urban fantasy series, once said that she felt like urban fantasy, as in its current incarnation, was used by marketing people to kind of differentiate these stories from paranormal romance. Because, you know, a paranormal romance fan goes into those books expecting kind of the sweeping love story that ends in a happily ever after, which of course is very rarely the case in an urban fantasy story, but that there are elements that would attract a romance reader, but they wanted to kind of say, look, you know, these stories, it's not your typical, it doesn't fit the conventions of romance, but you might like these, so we're going to, you know, give it a different name. That's just one theory of it. But it's kind of hard to pin down.
Right. I do think there's that common perception of urban fantasy, like, you know, I will admit, for me, what comes to mind immediately is the chick in leather on the cover with a knife and a werewolf or a vampire in the background or something like that.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate.
Team Jacob.
I think
Those
of the
are not
Dresden
urban
Files.
fantasy, by the way.
That's interesting that you say that because I've heard that Twilight is classified as urban fantasy.
That's not true. Well, some people may call it that, but to me, if you take the romance out and the story falls apart, it's not urban fantasy.
Could it be romantic urban fantasy?
I mean, you can call it whatever you want. That's the thing. It's like, I am asked this question like all the time, and it gets to the point where it's like, look, I don't really care what you call it, just buy it because it's good. Like it's just fun to read, and it's hard, I think, because as humans, we really like things that are easy to kind of categorize. We like to know the conventions of what we're reading. We read this. We read mystery because we want, the detective to find the bad guy and bring the bad guy to justice. And we read fantasy because we want to read the epic journey. And we read romance because we want to see the happily ever after. Those are conventions of those genres. And urban fantasy doesn't fall neatly in any of those, and it confuses people because we like to know what we're getting. But unfortunately, it's such a broad category that you really don't know. And unfortunately, those covers that you mentioned really telegraph to a lot of people that they're picking up a romance novel. And I am a fan of romance. I really like it, but that's not what I write with these books. And so I think it's really frustrating to have people say, well, I'm not going to read that because it's a romance when it's just not. It's just not,
Yeah.
So a lot of it's the marketing.
So, but I want to give you a chance to keep saying, why is it unfortunate that when I hear urban fantasy, my first thought is that cover? Why is that unfortunate? I think I know the answer, but I want to hear you say it.
Well, first of all, because a lot of people won't take the book seriously because it's a lot of them really objectify women and put them in these like ridiculous poses and make them caricatures. And they're put on books where authors actually spent a lot of time on character development and like writing a really great like kind of epic story, and people see the cover and they think, oh, that's paranormal romance, so they get dismissed a lot. I have had many times, and it's mainly guys, but not always. I've had women ask too, if they're romance or if the books are just for women. And I am a woman and I write about, female protagonists, but that doesn't mean that, I don't want guys reading my books. I write stories just to write good stories. I don't say, well, I'm going to pick this plot point because I know it'll appeal to women. It's you end up kind of getting put in this pink ghetto. And,
right.
That's right.
I think that's one of the downsides of the fact that they've created a successful marketing term, urban fantasy, which was probably, if I'm not wrong, mostly targeted toward women, female readers, and female protagonists, and so on. I mean, I think the marketing was aimed at that initially, wasn't it?
I think it probably was with certain lines. Of course, books have been called, before the marketing kind of push for urban fantasy started, books were called urban fantasy, and I think that's what frankly pisses a lot of fantasy fans off because they think of Charles DeLint and people like that, and they're like, that's urban fantasy. Not these chicks who are
Jim Butcher, the Dresden Files.
Yeah, but although I don't see his books any different from that they're much different from a lot of the female-driven urban fantasy. It's just they're marketed very differently. They're marketed to attract a male audience, and so they will read his books. I actually had a bookseller. I was on a panel once with a bunch of other female authors, and this bookseller stands up and he's like, yeah, I really try and get people interested in the genre. And we're like, great, that's wonderful. And he's like, so when I have a man come in and he says, what's this urban fantasy about? He gives him Jim Butcher. Of course, since this time, people like Kevin Hearn and Anton Strout and some other male authors have, had quite a bit of success in the genre. But then Jim was the dude. And so they start him off, Jim Butcher's their gateway drug. And then once they've read Jim, they'll come back in and be like, what else do you have? And the man actually said this to this panel. He said, well, if you don't mind reading a book written by a woman, I would suggest this person. And I swear, it was like, what year is it
Right.
that you would ever have to say that to somebody, you know? But unfortunately, there are people who think that a book written by a woman just is of no interest to them. So, you know, but we don't worry about those people because, you know.
Yeah, I agree.
They have their own issues.
I agree it's an incredibly weird thing to say. But there is a certain thing, certain kernel of something in that, which is that a lot of male readers don't like to read, for example, books with female protagonists. And this is particularly true, I think, of younger male readers. I've heard David Farland talk about this. And there is just some sexism, just natural sexism where, you know, a lot of guys won't think. That's why a lot of women use initials, right, as their pseudonyms. Right. You know, KC, you know, and I love reading, like, my friend, you know, KC May and her reviews and the reviewers talking about her as a dude, you know, writing, yeah, he wrote a great book. And I'm like...
Really? I automatically assume if it's initials that it's a woman. As Everyday Fiction, the editor of Everyday Fiction, we used to get, I think, 300 submissions. I'm sure we still do, but I'm not as active as I was. 300 submissions a month, and 99.5% of the time, when it was initials, it was a woman.
Right, but the reason they do that is because Joe Public doesn't know that initials means it's a woman.
Really? I have an interesting story about that. When I was in college, I took a creative writing course, and during the course of this course, we had to write some flash fiction, and, you know, there would be volunteers or people would be called on to read it in class. So I wrote this flash fiction piece, and it was from the viewpoint of a woman. And I read it aloud, and there was a weekend that went by, and the next class came back, and one of the dudes from the class came up to me as I was talking to some other girls from the class, and he said, "Hey, so what'd you do over the weekend?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, I went up to Big Bear with Jordan." I said his name because he didn't know it was my brother, and the guy kind of looks at me and he gives me a little wink and he goes, "You're gay, right?" And I'm like, "What?" Like, it was very confusing. Wow. And so he elucidated that he thought I was gay because I'd written that story from a woman's perspective.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I think, you know, it gets kind of crazy, and, you know, people lob the sexism word around a lot, and misogyny and stuff like that, and that stuff absolutely exists. And I didn't realize how much it exists until I became a writer, frankly. But I think a lot of it's just societal conditioning. You know, I don't think a lot of men who don't read books written by women are like, I hate women. You know, I think it's just that boys are taught that books about girls are for girls. And, you know, my son has dealt with that. He's 11, and he is the son of a female author, and so he reads books written by women. And he went to the book fair and bought a book that is marketed to girls, and one of the boys in his class was like, "Why are you reading that?" And he's like, "Well, why wouldn't I?" You know, and I was like, "Well, I don't, you know, are books really for boys or for girls?" And of course he thinks they are, because that's what we teach our kids. And I said, "Well, you know, I like Star Wars." And he said, "Well, Star Wars is for everyone." But I think that there's a kernel of truth in that, is that we are taught that that stories by and for men are really for everyone, but stories by and for women are just for women. And so, you know, it's a thing that you struggle against. But, you know, I don't think that it's as much of an issue as it used to be. I have a huge male readership, and, you know, they obviously don't care, and I think it's ridiculous I even have to say that they don't care that I'm a woman. You know what I mean? So
let me ask you this. If I could ask a quick question, Moses, if that's all right. What would you say to a definition of being able to tell the difference between paranormal romance and urban fantasy by saying that if you take romance out of the supernatural romance, then it is obviously a romance novel, but if you take it out of the urban fantasy and the story still works, then it is obviously urban fantasy and not romance?
Yes, that's absolutely what I think. Because in my books there is... See, because I see, like my Sabina Cain series is a 5-book saga about this one character's journey. And part of her journey to figuring out who she is and saving the world and all of that stuff is, you know, she has allies, she creates allies, and she creates enemies, and, you know, she's living her life, and part of her life is romance. Like it's part of everybody's life in some form, probably, most people. And so I thought, well, if I'm writing a realistic journey for a person, then that's going to be part of it. And it's a subplot. You could take that out and still have a completely, functioning story, a good one. But I think the fact that there's sex in the books, some people think, oh, that must be romance. Completely ignoring that plenty of male authors write sex, but that's
Dune. Dune.
Oh, there's so much sex in Dune.
It's clearly romance.
Is it romance?
Yeah.
Let's piss a lot of people off. Dune is a romance novel. But that's the thing. It's just this weird double standard, but whatever.
I'm actually in
Urban
favor.
fantasy is awesome, I think.
I'm in favor of actually separating urban fantasy out into its own, kind of area in a bookstore, for instance, right? Because, whenever I go into a bookstore, there's that fantasy and science fiction aisle, which is a ghetto, right? And there's just, I don't think it serves any purpose to have, like an urban fantasy novel right next to the Warhammer novels that I write, right? Because, those are going to be two very different people, right?
And it's confusing for readers because you'll find them in all the different sections. I've found my books in romance, fantasy, and horror.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're just put in general fiction. It just really depends.
No wonder people are confused about what the heck urban fantasy is.
Absolutely. And the only saving grace is that, since so many people are doing their shopping online now, you can actually go in and put into a search window urban fantasy, and they'll come up. And there are so many wonderful blogs and things that review urban fantasy and kind of direct people towards where to go. But I don't think like the general reader finds their books that way. They walk, a lot of people just walk into a bookstore
and look at the covers.
Yeah, and look at the covers, and then they see a chick with a katana with a, were-minotaur behind her, and they're like, oh.
And think, awesome.
What is a were-minotaur? Isn't that just a minotaur?
A hairy minotaur.
I suppose it is, yeah.
But,
no, he only turns into a minotaur once a month.
Moving on from hairy minotaurs, since we are doing a writing podcast and we have people who listen to the show who think, hey, what should I write next? How is the market doing in general for urban fantasy? It seems like over the years I've heard it's been very strong, but I don't know what's current, really.
Well, unfortunately, like a lot of genres that New York creates, it got a little glutted, and I think that it's very, very difficult right now to sell a new urban fantasy series. I think a lot of the players are already pretty established, and because they put a lot of, frankly, this may not make a lot of people happy that I'm going to say this, but they put a lot of derivative stuff out there, because the demand is there, and so people get sick of the same kind of story, and so at this point, what I'm hoping is going to happen is that a lot of the authors like myself who wrapped up a series in the last couple of years are going to come out with something new that'll kind of create some new trends in urban fantasy that, will kind of add fresh blood to the genre, if you will. But it's a really tough market. Like pretty much just from what I'm hearing, like the foreign markets for urban fantasy have completely shut down. Like they just aren't buying it anymore, which is kind of an indicator. Huh. So, I'm sure there are some authors who are, but just from what I'm hearing, they're like, we're really cutting back on urban fantasy right now. And I think that's because it was really hot and they bought a lot of properties and they didn't do very well. And so, I don't know. I don't know what the next big thing, I hope it's Dirty Magic. I hope that's the next big thing. But, and actually I would even, like, I actually describe those books as like speculative crime fiction because there's some elements that you would expect in like a typical urban fantasy that aren't there. Like my main character is a human who's an adept, and there's this conceit in the story that certain people are born with the ability to do magic, and it's a genetic thing it's the same genetic marker that makes people left-handed. And so if you're born left-handed, you might have the ability to use magic, but then you have to learn how to do it. And so, but there aren't any others. There aren't any real monsters or anything. And the stories are kind of standalone cases that she's working on. You know, it's a little different from my last series, but they'll call it urban fantasy anyway because that's what I'm known for, and it kind of does fall into that category. But that's where we get into the whole semantics of it. So,
in terms of tie-in fiction, I wrote a series called Fireborn, which was urban fantasy, I suppose, even though it was set a little bit in the future, and that got canceled. So I'm no longer writing that series. And then if you think for tie-ins, you were thinking of existing properties, so Supernatural is a urban fantasy tie-in universe that's still under production. I think you can still get Buffy comic books and such. But other than that, there aren't a lot of urban fantasy tie-ins that I can think of offhand. So I don't know if that's just because the tie-in market lags behind the actual book market, or if it's a different audience that reads tie-ins, but there just aren't a lot.
Well, and if you look at Hollywood too, like what they're buying, like I know Kelly Armstrong just sold a series to, like, I guess it got greenlit. And then there's things like The Witches of East End, but I think that's based on YA. Don't quote me on that. And so we're seeing a lot of like witch stuff coming out, and of course Sleepy Hollow just started, and I guess that's urban fantasy.
Four different Sleepy Hollow series on various channels.
Oh, really?
Whoa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't list them all right now, but
I was just thinking, Jay, you were saying that a lot of urban fantasy tends to have a first-person point of view.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and you think of like the Dresden Files, and like how could someone do tie-in work for that world? You know, because the readers are so used to Harry Dresden, right? And it seems like the authors would become so synonymous with their protagonists and those characters, and they would so define that even a successful urban fantasy series or franchise, like, it seems like it would be hard to do tie-ins to that.
Tie-ins generally aren't to novel properties originated in novels, although you do have stuff like Don Pendleton's The Executioner. So, I mean, you can call that a tie-in, and a lot of tie-in writers I know write that, but it's under the name Don Pendleton, right? It's not tied into anything but his actual series. But yeah, generally tie-in properties start elsewhere, like in movies, or Warhammer started with the figures, the game, right, and kind of so on, right?
Okay.
Yeah, so, you know, like it would be difficult, but I don't know. I mean, do you call Dune a tie-in series, right? Kevin J. Anderson is writing that right now with Brian Herbert, right? Like, it's a different author writing in Dune, right?
It seems like just a continuation, though, because he's the only one doing it. Like, he took up the mantle, right?
Yeah.
What about the X-Files? Is that urban fantasy?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I don't think they're producing more novels in the X-Files, are they, right now?
I am not sure.
I don't know anybody that's writing them.
Yeah.
That was quite big at the time. Yeah, for sure. Good point.
So, Jay, when you were talking about, you started sort of answering one of my questions I hadn't asked, but like when you said that urban fantasy wasn't selling quite as well right now, especially in foreign markets, have you heard of things that are selling well right now? I'm just curious what you've heard, and you mentioned kind of which things are going on. And
You mean in like science fiction and fantasy realm, or just in general?
I guess so, or maybe other literary genres as well.
I don't know. I mean, I know a lot of my colleagues who had series canceled. You know, I mean, look, I mean, the book market is not doing well in general, right? I mean,
Yeah.
but, you know, and so a lot of publishers really started to, you know, tighten the belt, and so a lot of people had series dropped, and a lot of those authors are either going indie, or they're going to things like YA or new adult, or, you know, whatever, or they're writing paranormal romance, whatever, you know, they can sell. I mean, it's everything's in flux right now, so everybody's just kind of, you know, I think in all genres, kind of scrambling to make sure that they, you know, can still be putting stuff out. But it does bring up an interesting point, because a lot of people are going to indie, and I think that indie might keep urban fantasy going, because, you know, when you're with a big publisher, there's a lot of pressure to be a breakout and to be a bestseller, and if you aren't, and you're just, you know, a mid-lister, then you're considered disappointing. And unfortunately what's happening is a lot of really wonderful authors are, you know, not being given a chance to develop a career. But now they can go and publish stuff in indie, and so a lot of people are experimenting with putting out novellas and in established universes or continuing series on their own and that kind of thing. So I don't mean I know that there are a lot of fans of urban fantasy who might be listening to this who are like disheartened to hear that, you know, it's changing, but there still are really wonderful urban fantasies coming out. And, but I just think we're at this kind of tipping point where we're waiting to see what the next breakout's going to be in urban fantasy, what the new trend's going to be. But I don't think we're going to keep seeing, you know, the tough chicken leather thing as much anymore.
I would say that urban fantasy as a genre is probably healthier than a lot of other ones out there.
Maybe. I mean, I guess there are a lot of unhealthy genres right now.
Yeah.
A good example of what you were just talking about, Jay, in among indie authors, Deborah Geary. I don't know if you know of her, but she has a series, a very, very, very successful series on Amazon for the Kindle, with kind of a witchy element to them. I think they're a little bit more lighthearted, though, than you might think. But her series is just done hugely, hugely well, and she's been picked up by, I forget who. But, yeah, someone who's just a very smart independent author who just sold gazillions of books on her own. And, you can do that as an independent author if you know, people are doing it all the time. It's definitely being done all the time. It's been that way for many years now. And, that's definitely there. You mentioned new adult fiction. I thought we should define that for people who don't know what that is.
Well, I think if there's, you know, you thought urban fantasy was hard to define. I think new adult is actually even harder because it's so new. But I think it's really not so. My knowledge on this is limited, but it's kind of like YA in that it's a genre defined by a demographic that it's aimed for, and so new adult is kind of college aged, so kind of like 18 to like 22-year-old protagonists, I guess.
Wikipedia says 18 to 25 for what it's worth.
Okay. Yeah.
Wow, you heard just about her right on. That was impressive.
So I, you know, what I'm hearing about it, I have not read any new adult, and, you know, if somebody out there has read it and, you know, like, don't send me angry emails, but my impression is that a lot of it's very similar to chick lit in that it's kind of it's a coming of age kind of story, a woman trying to find her way in the world kind of thing. That's my impression of it. I'm not real sure, but,
that jives with, because I've been seeing a lot of new adult. I mean, and actually I haven't classed it this way, but the authors that I work with immediately tell me, I have this new adult book, and it jives with everything that you just said.
Okay.
Nice. So we need to do a show on new adult sometime. Get some new adult author in here to educate all of us dumb heads. Okay, so it's getting late because I'm using words like dumbhead, and that's never a good thing. So I think it's time to wrap up a little bit. Any final thoughts on urban fantasy? Joshua?
Okay, a final thought. Another clarification between supernatural romance and urban fantasy. I think that another one could very well be that in the romance genre, you're generally going to be having single books and not series. Mm-hmm. And if you have a series where the main character, the protagonist, continues through all those books, that's probably going to be urban fantasy.
Agreed.
Jordan?
I love urban fantasy as a genre, and, you know, I mean, I think it is much broader than people think about. When I think about urban fantasy, I guess Stephen King, like almost all of his stuff, could qualify as urban fantasy, even though there's a strong horror element. So, you know, I mean, The Stand could I guess that's post-apocalyptic, but it could.
Yeah, that's fantasy. Dystopian science fiction too.
Yeah, you know, I mean, so on. It's not science fiction, I wouldn't think, because, you know, there's.
Well, yeah, dystopian fantasy, really, right?
Yeah.
The Walking Man is the devil, essentially.
Yeah. So, you know, I think it's really broad, and I think it's really interesting to set stories in our world and then subvert it. I think overall it's kind of a subversive genre, and that's what really intrigues me about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say is just it's been nice speaking with you about this, Jay, and just remembering or maybe even realizing that, you know, urban fantasy is incredibly broad, and there's all sorts of things going on in it, and there's, you know, crime and mystery and all this other stuff, and just to make sure my mind is open so that my radar can pick up when, oh, here's a cool urban fantasy book. I don't have to put it in my own pink ghetto in my own mind. So, yeah, so that's a good thing. And then, Jay, you can say anything you want right now.
Oh, that's dangerous.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I want to say is that what's really, I think, been great about the success of urban fantasy is it has kind of opened up the market for the idea that, blending genres is cool. And so we're seeing a lot more experimentation, not necessarily with books that are just urban fantasy, but I think we're getting a little bit more comfortable with kind of blending, which is creating all sorts of new stories, which is very exciting, and it's a really cool thing as a writer to be allowed the ability to kind of break out of the confines of traditional genre and experiment a little bit and be embraced by readers and by, the gatekeepers in New York. So, if you haven't read urban fantasy, I would, really encourage you to give it a try. There's really a story out there for everyone. It's just you have to find the balance of elements that you like and find those authors. So give it a try.
Awesome. Well, thanks for listening to the show, and we'll be back soon. I think Jay's going to join us again in the future, so hope you look forward to that, and we'll catch you next time.
This has been another episode of Hide and Create. The show is produced by me, Jordan Ellinger. The site is edited by Joshua Essoe, and my co-hosts have been Jay Wells and Moses Siregar. That music that you're listening to was written by Jason Donnelly. We can be reached at writingpodcastonline.com, where you can ask us questions or suggest topics for future shows. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider reviewing us on iTunes, liking our Facebook page, or subscribing to the Hide and Create YouTube channel. That's all for now. Now go hide and create something.